In the year 2130, humanity was fighting an alien species known as the Groll. These creatures were far more advanced than humans. They had huge ships, powerful weapons, and thick armor that made them nearly impossible to defeat. Their armor could block almost any kind of weapon. At first, the humans tried many different ways to fight back, but every plan failed. The Grollen kept pushing forward, and it seemed like Earth would lose. But then, there was a breakthrough. A young engineer named Han Jae-hen worked for the Earth Defense Force, EDF. He was always thinking of new ways to improve weapons and defenses. Jae-hen was smart, and he never gave up, even when things seemed hopeless. He spent days and nights working in his lab, studying the Grown armor. He noticed something strange. The armor wasn't completely invincible. It could resist most attacks. But there might be a way to break through it. Jae-hen believed that, with the right kind of force or energy, the Grollen's armor could be pierced. He was excited by this discovery, but he knew he needed help. He went to Jung Ha-jin, a top pilot in the EDF, to explain his idea. Ha-jin was calm and focused, always thinking clearly during a mission. She trusted Jae-hen's judgment, and after listening to his plan, she agreed to help. "Let's make it work," Ha-jin said. Together, they began to design a new weapon. It was called the Anything Penetrator, AP round. It was a type of ammunition that could break through the Grollen's powerful armor. Jae-hen worked on the technology, while Ha-jin tested the designs. They knew they were on to something big, but there was a lot of work to do. Every step had to be perfect. They couldn't trust just anyone with this secret. Only a few people knew about the AP round. One of those people was Ryu Seokjin, a tough military leader who was in charge of the EDF's most dangerous missions. Seokjin was known for his bravery, but he didn't always trust new technology. He preferred to rely on his soldiers and experience. When Jae-hen told him about the AP round, Seokjin wasn't sure it would work. "We can't rely on a new weapon in the middle of this war," Seokjin said. "We need our troops ready, not just a new tool." Jae-hen understood his concern but wasn't ready to give up. This could turn the tide. The Grollen won't expect it? If we can break through their armor, we'll have a real chance. Seokjin thought for a moment, then nodded. He trusted Jae-hen, even if he didn't fully believe in the weapon. "All right, but if this goes wrong, we'll be in more trouble than before." The team worked together in secret. They built the first batch of AP rounds and prepared to test them. It was a risky plan, but they had no choice. The Grollen were getting stronger every day. Earth's defenses were weakening. The test would take place at a secret military base deep in the mountains. The Grollen had left behind a damaged ship during one of their attacks, and this ship had the same kind of armor they used on their battleships. It was the perfect target for the test. The team arrived early in the morning. The air was cold, and the sky was gray, a sign that something big was about to happen. Jae-hen and Ha-jin were ready. Seokjin stood by, watching carefully. "This is it," Jae-hen said, his voice steady but filled with nervous excitement. Ijin nodded, checking her gear. She was used to high-pressure situations, but this felt different. If the test failed, they could lose everything. The plan was simple. Ha-jin would fly a small fighter ship close to the damaged Grollen ship. Jae-hen would guide her, making sure the AP rounds hit the target. If the armor could be penetrated, it would prove the weapon could work in real battle. Ha-jin climbed into the cockpit and sealed the door. Jae-hen stood by the control panel, watching her on the monitor. He had designed the system so Ha-jin could fire the rounds from her ship, but he would still be the one to make the final adjustments. "Ready when you are." Ha-jin's voice came through the radio. "On my mark," Jae-hen replied. They waited in silence. The Grollen ship sat ahead, its dark, smooth surface gleaming in the dull light. It looked almost invincible, but they had to try. Jae-hen pressed a button on the console. The first AP round was launched. The round flew through the air, spinning toward the Grollen ship. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down. Then, with a loud explosion, the round hit the target. A shock wave rippled through the air. The Grollen armor cracked. It didn't break completely, but there was a large dent where the round had hit. Jae-hen's heart raced. It was working. They had done it. Hyjin quickly followed up with another round, and this time, the armor split open. The Grolan's ship was no longer invulnerable. The team cheered, but their celebration was short-lived. They knew the Grolan would soon find out what had happened. And once they did, they would come after Earth with everything they had. "We need to act fast," Seokujin said. "The Grolan will be looking for a way to counter this. We can't waste time." Jaehyun nodded. "We've proven it works. Now we need to make sure we're ready." The team prepared to take the next step, knowing that the future of the war and possibly the future of Earth rested on their shoulders. Jaehyun, Hyjin, and Seojin stood in the control room, staring at the large screen in front of them. The Grolan ship had been damaged, but the battle was far from over. Now that they knew the Grolan armor could be pierced, they had to act quickly. The Grolan would soon learn about the new weapon, and they would do everything in their power to stop it. "We've done the first test, but now we need more," Jaehyun said, his voice steady but serious. "We need to mass-produce the AP rounds and get them to the front lines." Seochin nodded, though his face remained tense. "The Grolan will retaliate. They won't sit back and let us have this advantage for long." Hyjin, who had been silent for a moment, spoke up. "We'll need more than just the rounds. We'll need a way to deliver them effectively. The Grolan will be prepared for us now." Guihyun looked at her, then turned to Seochin. "We need a plan. The Grolan won't expect us to use the weapon in the way we intend." Seokjin folded his arms. "I'll set up a meeting with the top commanders. We need to make sure we can use the AP rounds quickly and on a large scale. We can't afford to waste any time." The next few days were a whirlwind of planning and testing. Jaehyun worked tirelessly to refine the design of the AP rounds, pushing himself to the limit. He knew that the future of the war rested on the success of this weapon. If they could get the rounds into the right hands, they might be able to turn the tide of the war. But the pressure was enormous. Every mistake could mean the loss of more lives. Meanwhile, Hyjin spent hours practicing with the new weapons in the simulator. She had always been a skilled pilot, but this was different. The AP rounds were powerful, but they required precision and careful timing. She needed to be ready for any situation that could arise. The weight of the task weighed heavily on her shoulders, but she refused to let it break her. Seok-Jin did what he did best. He led. He gathered the commanders and military leaders from around the world, explaining the new weapon and its potential. He knew that convincing the higher-ups to support the AP round was critical, but there were still doubts. Some questioned whether it was worth the risk. Others worried that it might not be enough to defeat the Grolan. "The Grolan are more than just their armor," which one of the commanders said. "We can't ignore their technology, their numbers. One weapon won't win this war." Seokin held his ground. "We don't need one weapon to win the war. We need the right weapon at the right time. The AP rounds are just the beginning. We'll make it work." Days turned into weeks as the team prepared for the next phase of the plan. Jaehyun and Hyjin tested the AP rounds over and over again, tweaking the design to make sure they would work under any conditions. They worked late into the night, their tired faces showing the strain of the pressure. At the same time, Seokujin organized the military forces, readying them for the next battle. The Grolan had already launched a series of attacks on Earth's outer colonies. It was only a matter of time before they turned their focus on the planet itself. Earth needed to be ready. The battle would be fought on multiple fronts, and every soldier, every pilot, every weapon would play a part. Finally, the day arrived when they were ready to launch the AP rounds into battle. The team had refined the weapon as much as possible, but there was still a sense of uncertainty. They had never faced an enemy like the Grolan before. Their enemies were ruthless, and they would not give up easily. Jaehyun stood in the control room, staring at the monitor that displayed the fleet of Grolan ships moving toward Earth. "This is it," Jaehyun said softly. "Everything we've worked for comes down to this moment." Hyjin, standing next to him, placed a hand on his shoulder. "We'll make it work. We have to." Seokjin stood at the front of the room, giving orders to the commanders. "All units, prepare for launch. The Grolan are coming. We fight now." Edda fleet was ready. Fighters and bombers lined up, their engines roaring to life. The AP rounds were loaded and ready to be fired. The battle would be fierce. But the humans had something the Groln didn't expect, hope, as the EDF fleet moved out. Jahan felt a rush of adrenaline. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. They had one shot to make a difference. They couldn't afford to fail. The first wave of Groen ships appeared on the horizon, their dark shapes blocking out the sun. The Grol had arrived. The battle for Earth had begun. Jahan, Haijin, and Seochin were at the heart of the battle. Haijin flew her fighter ship through the chaos, dodging enemy fire and weaving between explosions. She kept her focus, knowing that the success of the mission depended on her. She had trained for this moment. She wasn't going to let anything stop her. Jahan monitored the weapon systems from the command center, his eyes glued to the screen as the AP rounds were fired at the Grolling ships. The rounds hit their targets, creating massive explosions. But the Grolling were quick to adapt. They launched countermeasures to block the attacks, but the humans were ready. They had expected this. The battle raged on, with the humans using their new weapon to strike at the heart of the Grollen forces. The AP rounds kept hitting their targets, but the Grollen responded with brutal force. Their ships fired powerful energy weapons, sending waves of destruction across the battlefield. In the midst of the chaos, Seokin issued orders to the EDF fleet. Keep pushing forward. Don't let up. We can win this. The humans fought with everything they had, using every trick and every weapon at their disposal. It was a battle unlike anything they had ever faced before. But they had the AP rounds, and they had each other. As the day wore on, the Groln began to retreat. Their ships were heavily damaged, and their forces were scattered. The humans had gained ground, but the war was far from over. The Groln were not ready to give up yet, Jahan. Haijin and Seojin stood together in the control room, watching as the last of the Groln ships disappeared from the screen. We did it, Haijin said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jahan nodded. We've taken the first step, but the war isn't over yet. Seokjin looked out the window, his face hard and determined. The Grol will come back, but we'll be ready. The battle had been hard, but humanity had proven that they could fight back. The Grol had not expected the humans to be so resourceful. The AP rounds had worked, but the war was far from over. Now the Groln were planning their next move, and the humans had to be ready. Jahan sat in his lab, staring at the holographic map of the battlefield. He could see the scattered positions of the Grollen fleet, but he knew they would regroup soon. The Grol went on easily defeated. They were smart, and they would learn from their mistakes. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. He hadn't slept much in the past few days. There was always something new to fix, something new to improve. But the pressure was beginning to take its toll. Every decision he made could mean the difference between life and death. He could hear footsteps approaching. It was Haijin. She knocked on the door before entering. "You look like you haven't slept in days," she said, her voice soft but concerned. "We need you sharp." "We all do." Jahan smiled weakly. "I'm fine. Just thinking. The Grollen won't give up so easily. They'll figure out how to counter the AP rounds. We need to stay ahead of them." Haijin walked over to the table and looked at the holographic map. "We're doing everything we can. The AP rounds are working, but we need to find a way to make them even better. We need to get more of them to the front lines faster." "Ah," Jahan nodded. "Exactly. I'm working on a new delivery system. Something that can bring the rounds directly to the front in a matter of minutes. The longer it takes, the more lives we lose." Haijin glanced at him, her eyes serious. "How long do you think it will take?" Jahan hesitated. "I don't know. I'm pushing the limits of what we can do. But if we can't get the rounds where they're needed fast enough, it might be too late." Haijin sighed, then placed a hand on his shoulder. "We'll get it done. We always do." Meanwhile, Seo Kyujin was working on the military side of things. He had already gathered a new team of pilots, engineers, and soldiers to help with the upcoming fight. The Grol would be back, and they would come stronger than ever. He had to make sure the human forces were ready. "Ready for the next move," Seochin said as he walked into the command center. Where the commanders were meeting, the commanders looked at him. Some of them tired, others still shaken from the previous battle. They knew this was just the beginning. The Groen had learned a lot from their last defeat. They would come prepared this time. The Groen are regathering their forces, one of the commanders said. They're not just coming for Earth. They're coming for everything. We need to strike back hard, or we'll lose our chance. Seochin nodded. We'll do what we can. We'll use the AP rounds, but we need to make sure they don't counter it before we fire. We can't afford another mistake. The commanders agreed, and the planning began. They had a few days before the Groen launched their next assault, and they needed to make every second count. The AP rounds were their best weapon, but they needed to be used wisely. Jaehyun, Heejin, and Seochin worked together to finalize the new delivery system for the AP rounds. They couldn't afford to wait for traditional supply lines. They needed a way to get the rounds to the front instantly. It was a massive task, but the clock was ticking. While the team worked, the rest of the military forces prepared for the worst. Everyone knew that the next battle could be their last. There was no time to waste. The day of the next battle arrived faster than they expected. The Groen had gathered a massive fleet, and they were ready to strike. The humans had prepared as best as they could. But the feeling of uncertainty hung over them all. Jaehyun sat in the control room, staring at the screen as the Groen ships appeared in the distance. He could see the enemy fleet, huge and imposing. The Groen had been busy rebuilding and upgrading their ships. They were coming for Earth, and they were coming with everything they had. We have to hit them hard, Seokujin said, standing next to Jaehyun. This is our chance to push them back for good. Hajin entered the room, her face determined. The AP rounds are ready. The new delivery system is in place. We just need to launch. Jaehyun took a deep breath. Let's do this. The humans launched their first wave of attacks, using the new delivery system to send the AP rounds directly to the front lines. The rounds hit their targets, but the Groen quickly adapted, deploying new shields to block the attacks. Damn it, Seokujin muttered. They're already countering us. Jaehyun didn't hesitate. We have to push through. Keep hitting them with everything we've got. The battle intensified as the Groen retaliated with powerful weapons. The EDF fleet fired back, using their most advanced ships and technology. Hajin led the charge, her fighter ship weaving through enemy fire as she fired the AP rounds. The explosions lit up the sky as the rounds hit their marks, but the Groen were prepared. They had developed new countermeasures, and they were using them to block the AP rounds. The humans needed a new strategy. Jaehyun, we need a backup plan, Hajin radioed in. They're too strong. Jaehyun worked quickly, looking for a solution. He analyzed the data from the battlefield, trying to find a weakness in the Groen's new defense systems. He didn't have much time. The Groen were pressing forward, and the EDF forces were struggling to hold them back. Wait, Jaehyun said, his eyes lighting up as he found an opening. I have it. We'll adjust the frequency of the rounds. We can bypass their shields if we use a different energy signature. Hajin didn't hesitate. We'll do it. She gave the order to the other pilots, and they quickly made the adjustment. The new AP rounds were fired, this time with the modified energy signature. The Groen shields faltered as the rounds hit their targets. The Groen ships exploded one by one, and the humans gained ground. The battle continued for hours, with both sides taking heavy losses. But the humans had found their edge. The Groen were not invincible. They could be beaten. As the battle drew to a close, the Groen began to retreat. Their ships, once towering and powerful, were now broken and damaged. The humans had won another victory. Seok-Jin stood in the command center, watching as the last of the Groen ships disappeared from the radar. We did it, he said, his voice full of pride. Jaehyun and Hajin walked into the room, both exhausted but relieved. We have to be ready for the next one, Jaehyun said, his voice calm but firm. The Groen won't stop. But we've shown them that we can fight. Hajin nodded. We'll keep fighting. We have no choice. Seochin looked out the window at the dark sky. The war wasn't over. But for the first time in a long time, the humans had hope. The battle had ended, but the war was far from over. The Groen were not a race that gave up easily. They had been pushed back, but they would return. Everyone knew it. The question was not if, but when. Jian stood in the control room, staring at the holographic map. He could see the positions of the Groen fleet, still far from Earth, but slowly advancing. They were planning their next move. Jian had no doubt that they would come back stronger than before. They had already adapted to the AP rounds once. The next time they would be ready? Haijin walked into the room, her face tense. She had been flying non-stop for days, and the exhaustion was starting to show. But she knew that she couldn't afford to rest. Not now. They're still coming, she said, looking at the map. They've regrouped, and they've got more ships. A lot more. Jian didn't look away from the map. They'll be ready for us this time. We need something new. Something they won't expect. Haijin raised an eyebrow. What do you have in mind? Jian didn't answer right away. He was thinking hard, running through possibilities in his mind. The AP rounds had been their best weapon, but they were no longer enough. The Growling were adapting quickly. They needed a new strategy, a new way to surprise them. He turned to Haijin. We've been focusing too much on the rounds. It's time to think bigger. We need something that can hit them where it hurts, something that goes beyond just the armor. Haijin thought for a moment, then nodded. You're thinking about a new weapon. Jian smiled, though it was more of a tired grin. Exactly. But it won't be easy. It'll take time, and we don't have much of that. Haijin nodded again. We'll make it work. Meanwhile, Seo Jin was working on the battlefield plans. The EDF had suffered heavy losses, and while the recent victory was a boost, it was clear that Earth's defenses were still stretched thin. They needed more ships, more pilots, more everything. He sat in a meeting with the top commanders, going over the next steps. The Groll are regrouping, but they're not just coming for Earth. They want to make an example of us. They want to show the galaxy that they can crush us. If we're going to stop them, we need to hit back harder. One of the commanders spoke up. We need more ships, more pilots. We can't keep relying on a few fighters in the AP rounds. Gagan nodded. I agree. But right now, we don't have time to build new ships. We need to focus on what we have. And what we have is our people, our soldiers, our pilots. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of the situation settling over them. We'll make do with what we have, Seochin said finally. But we need to be ready for what's coming. The Groll will be stronger this time. We have to be prepared. Back in the lab, Jian was working on the new weapon. He had been up all night, tweaking designs and making adjustments. The pressure was overwhelming. If the new weapon didn't work, they would be finished. The Groll would wipe them out. Haijin entered the lab, looking worn but determined. How's it going? Jian looked up from his work. I think I've got it. It's not perfect, but it's our best shot. Haijin moved closer, peering over his shoulder at the new weapon design. It was different from anything they had used before. It wasn't a round or a missile. It was a new type of energy weapon, something that could target the Groll's weak spots directly. It's risky, she said, but I think it could work. The Groll won't expect it. Jian nodded. That's the plan. We need to hit them where it hurts, and this might be the only way to do it. They worked together, making the final adjustments. The new weapon would take time to build, but it was their only hope. They had no choice but to push forward. The next few days were a blur of planning and preparation. The EDF had no choice but to rely on their limited resources. Every pilot, every soldier was needed. They couldn't afford to waste anyone. The Groll were coming, and they had to be ready. SEO Kajin oversaw the final stages of the preparation. We've got one shot at this, he said. If we fail, it's over. Tension in the air was thick. The pilots, the soldiers, everyone knew what was at stake. They had already lost so much. This was their chance to turn the tide. Finally, the day arrived. The Groll fleet had reached Earth's outer defenses. The battle was about to begin. Jian stood in the control room, his fingers hovering over the buttons. He had spent days working on the new weapon, but there was still a part of him that feared it wouldn't work. What if the Groen had found a way to counter it? What if they were too strong? Hyjin stepped up next to him. You did everything you could. Now it's time to let the weapon do the rest. Ayan nodded, though his mind was still racing. I just hope it works. Seochin's voice came through the comm system. All units, prepare for launch. The Grolan are here. Let's show them what we've got. The battle began, and it was everything they had feared. The growing ships were massive, their weapons devastating. The EDF forces fought bravely. The Groan were relentless. Jaehyun and Hyjin watched as the new weapon was deployed. It was a risky move, but it was the only one they had. The energy beam shot out, striking the Grolan ships directly. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the Grolan ship at the center of the blast exploded in a massive fireball. The EDF cheered. The weapon had worked, but it wasn't over yet. The Grolan had suffered heavy damage, but they were still coming. Seochin was in the middle of the battlefield, issuing orders to the pilots. Keep pushing forward. We can win this. The battle raged on, but the humans were starting to gain the upper hand. The Grolan were weakening, their ships falling one by one. The new weapon had changed the course of the battle. It was their chance to win, but the Grolan were not going to give up so easily. They launched their final attack, sending a massive fleet toward Earth. It was their last chance to crush humanity once and for all. Jaehyun knew that they couldn't afford to make another mistake. The new weapon had given them a fighting chance, but it wasn't enough to end the war. They needed something more. The Grolan were coming. Their massive fleet was closing in on Earth, and the pressure was mounting. This was it, the final battle. Humanity had already been pushed to the brink, but they were still standing. They had proven they could fight, but the Grolan were relentless. The question was whether they could survive this last assault. Jaehyun stood in the control room, staring at the monitor. The Grolan fleet was larger than anything they had faced before. They had every advantage: more ships, stronger weapons, and better defenses. But the humans had something the Grolan didn't expect: hope. They had the new weapon, and they had their will to survive. The battlefield outside was a mix of fire, explosions, and chaos. The EDF fleet had mobilized every pilot and soldier preparing for the fight of their lives. But even with the new weapon, they knew it wasn't going to be enough unless they could hit the Groan where it really hurt. Jaehyun turned to Hyjin, who stood beside him. Her face was calm, but he could see the tension in her eyes. She had flown countless missions, but this one felt different. This time, they weren't just fighting for victory, they were fighting for survival. We can't let them reach Earth, Jaehyun said, his voice low. If they get through, it's over. We have to hold them off. We can't afford to make any mistakes. Hyjin nodded, her fingers tightening around the controls. We won't let that happen. The new weapon was ready. Jaehyun had worked non-stop to make the final adjustments. It was a modified version of the energy weapon they had used in the previous battle, but this time it was more powerful, more precise. It was humanity's last hope. Launch the weapon, Seochin's voice came through the comms, breaking the silence. Now, the order was given, and the new weapon was deployed. The energy beam shot out toward the incoming Grolan fleet, cutting through the darkness. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, an explosion echoed across the battlefield. One of the Grolan ships was hit directly, its shields shattering under the power of the weapon. It was the first time the Grolan had shown any sign of weakness. Direct hit. A commander shouted over the radio. The shields are down. The weapon works. The humans had gained a small victory, but it was far from over. The Grolan quickly regrouped, their ships moving in a defensive formation. The weapon had made a dent in their forces, but the battle was still raging. The Grolan were determined to crush the humans once and for all. Hyjin pressed forward, her fighter ship weaving through enemy fire. The explosions around her were deafening, but she stayed focused. She had trained for this moment. She had prepared for this fight. And now, she was determined to win. Keep pushing, Seochin ordered. We've got them on the run. Don't let up. The EDF pilots launched their next wave of attacks, using the new weapon to strike at the Groan ships. One by one, their shields fell. One by one, their ships exploded. The Groan were losing, but they weren't finished yet. Jaehyun watched the battle unfold, his heart pounding. He could see the damage the Grolin were taking, but he also knew that they weren't going to stop. The Grolin had the strength and the numbers to keep fighting. They could still win. We need to end this, Jaehyun muttered to himself. We need to hit them harder. He turned to Haijin. We need a final strike. Something that will finish them once and for all. Haijin looked at him, her face hard with determination. What do you have in mind? Jaehyun's eyes narrowed as he thought quickly. We need to aim for their command ship. If we take out their leadership, the rest of their forces will collapse. But the command ship is heavily guarded, Haijin pointed out. It'll be a suicide mission. Jaehyun didn't flinch. We don't have a choice. If we don't take it out now, they'll keep coming. They'll never stop. Haijin hesitated for a moment, then nodded. All right, let's do it. They knew it was a risky plan, but it was their only chance. The command ship was the heart of the Grown fleet. If they could destroy it, they could end the war. But it wasn't going to be easy. The EDF fleet pushed forward, fighting through the growing defenses. The new weapon fired again and again, striking down the Grolin ships, but the command ship was still heavily protected. It was surrounded by an array of defensive shields. The Grolin were guarding it with everything they had. Haijin flew her fighter ship toward the command ship, dodging incoming fire as she closed in. The sky was filled with explosions, but she kept her focus. She had one shot, and she couldn't afford to miss.